Hello. Welcome to the Wilson Center event celebrating refugee talents and host country leadership. I am John Thorn Majuk, Director of the Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative here at the Wilson Center. RAPD aims to inform policymakers and practitioners by expanding the space for new perspectives, constructive dialogue, and sustainable solutions. Chartered by U.S. Congress in 1968, the Wilson Center provides nonpartisan counsel and insights on global affairs to policymakers through deep research, impartial analysis, and independent scholarship. We bring fresh thinking to the most pressing global challenges we face. Forced displacement is one of those challenges. Forced displacement is a defining issue of the 21st century, and this reality has implications for how we talk about refugees. In its annual Global Trends Report, which was just released, UNHCR estimates more than 117 million forcibly displaced people, displaced by various crises, mostly conflict from around the world, from Sudan to the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan to Syria, Venezuela to Ukraine, Gaza to Myanmar, and more. Against this backdrop, we are celebrating the courage of more than 43 million refugees who live in more than 100 different host countries. Just an example of what we are celebrating, 36 refugee athletes are going to participate in the Paris Olympic this year, and they represent 11 countries of origin and hosted by 15 different host countries. That is what we are celebrating, the talents. The United Nations designated June 20th as World Refugee Day to focus global attention on the plight of those fleeing conflict and persecution. In observance of this day, we host this event to celebrate talents and host country leadership and to enhance public awareness about their positive contribution. When host countries create a policy environment that gives refugees safety, freedom, and opportunity to utilize their talents, they will in turn enrich and impact their respective host countries. How do refugees positively impact host communities? What lesson can we learn from them? What policy environment will help them thrive? To help us address this question and more, we have great speakers here with us. People who have lived experience, who have shaped refugee narrative through their work, and industry and government leaders who have provided opportunities for refugees. Speakers will discuss the flourishing of refugee talents when host country leadership gives them opportunities and recognize their human agency and potential. Thank you for joining us here and for tuning in online. It's now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Elizabeth Campbell is the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration at the U.S. Department of State, where she is responsible for humanitarian assistance and multilateral coordination and external affairs. Her long career path includes both inside and outside the government. She was a senior policy advisor in the Bureau of International Organization Affairs at the State Department, senior advocate for Refugees International, and director of Refugee Council USA. He has also worked for UNHCR in Kenya and UNRWA office here in Washington, D.C. Dr. Campbell has served as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Law, James Madison University, and the State University of New York, where she obtained her master and PhD in sociology. Madam Deputy Assistant Secretary, the podium is yours.
Thank you so much for that really warm introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here. And Jonathan, thank you so much for your leadership of this extremely important program at a really, really critical moment. I'm very honored to be here and to say a few words on behalf of the State Department, but also the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, and the work that we do on refugees and migrants. And I'm so pleased that the focus of today's discussion is really on refugee empowerment and refugee access to labor, work, education, and broadly what I often refer to as solutions. Yes, there's huge amounts of humanitarian need globally, but funding and humanitarian assistance alone is insufficient to meet that need, and increasingly we have to put our limited resources towards solutions. So you asked me a few questions. The first is, what policy environment will help refugees thrive? This is sort of obvious, but worth stating. And we see, around the world, particularly in the African continent where I focus most of my work and where my responsibilities lie, that what we have are sometimes what we refer to as these legacy refugee camps, right? Where at a particular historical moment, refugees crossed an international border, they were received by the international community, and many of them have been in those same locations 10, 20, 30, even 40 years, sometimes longer. This is not an environment for refugees in which refugees can thrive. Basic rights have to be respected, to include freedom of movement, access to the labor market, access to appropriate documentation, education, and importantly, and here I would emphasize, using limited humanitarian assistance resources in a way that creates conditions to enable that type of policy environment. This is really critical. The second question you asked is, what is PRM, the Population, Refugees, and Migration Bureau, doing differently on solutions? And here, we feel that the Biden administration has a fairly strong track record, and I wanted to spend a bit of time today on this question. So on this issue I just mentioned of addressing these legacy refugee camps and protracted situations, we've been doing a number of things. The first initiative I'll mention is a partnership that we built together with the World Economic Forum. And together with them and a wide variety of other partners, UN, international organizations, foundations, multilateral development banks, as well as business leaders, on the margins of the UN General Assembly last fall, we launched a $10 billion call to action to raise commercial and catalytic capital and to scale economic activity in fragile and frontier markets, to include in many places where refugees reside. So this is really a paradigm shift. When we think about large-scale refugee movements, we think about what is the policy environment that helped them thrive. Everyone, well, at least many people know and agree, they come with their own assets, their own abilities and skills to engage in work. But how do we do that? A piece of that puzzle must be enabling the private sector and seeing the private sector as a central component and thread of finding ways for refugees, once they cross an international border, to seek employment and opportunities. So this is a little bit about what that partnership is about. It's about saying that humanitarian assistance is important but insufficient to reach these goals, building broad-based partnerships, including with the private sector, foundations, business leaders, and others, and the belief that even in places where you have extremely fragile markets or nascent markets or almost no market, that there are often local, national, regional, if not sometimes also international actors who want to do business in those places using often the assets of the refugees and vulnerable migrants themselves. So to date, we have about 50 partners who've joined this initiative. They collectively have made 55 commitments on impact investment. We were just in Nairobi last week. One of the areas where we're focusing our attention is in northern Kenya. This is a place where we have these long-term protracted legacy camps. And we're trying to work in partnership with the government on their stated policy goals of social and economic inclusion of some 600,000 refugees. And this is a piece of that effort. Secondly, and this is a long-standing issue on which we have long been focused in Washington, but trying to be much more effective at tying U.S. government resources, humanitarian resources, to our development work in any given place. That is a very easy thing to say. We have all been saying that for those of us working in this space for some time, but actually really trying to marry up those programs, those timelines, those resources, but importantly, and this is where I would emphasize, what outcomes are we trying to achieve? When we look at humanitarian outcomes, we are often thinking about the immediate needs of today, but we know that most likely refugees will be there tomorrow into the next decade. So what outcomes are we trying to achieve? The third piece is our relationship with multilateral development banks, which we see and believe is a key component to fostering positive refugee outcomes where refugees are empowered and leading on their own future. Here, of course, you have some key instruments that came about around 2016, the window for host communities and refugees, and then, of course, the Global Concessional Financing Facility, to which the United States has contributed around $130 million or so since that time. We remain strongly committed to these efforts, and I think there is a lot more that we can do, and not just with these banks, but also with the Africa Development Bank and others. A fourth piece, and something that we invested in just earlier this year, is a new initiative with our partner UNHCR. So together with the IFC, they've formed a new joint initiative, again, looking at bringing the technical and policy guidance, technical assistance and policy guidance necessary to find ways to bring private sector solutions to longstanding refugee context. Then I would just say very, very broadly, one of the ways that we are trying to shape this outcome from a policy perspective is with our key partners at the State Department, really encouraging and finding and helping to shape solutions from the start. It cannot be an afterthought. It cannot be something that we dabble on the side or on the margins. It cannot be something that is funded at the lowest possible level after all of the other our needs are met. If we want more refugees working, if we want more refugee rights, if we want more refugee access to education, and we want more refugee dignity, solutions, broadly speaking, to include access to work have to be considered basically from day one of a response. So that's something where we've also spent quite a lot of time. And then finally, but not least, Welcome Corps at Work, which is a groundbreaking pilot initiative within the overarching Welcome Corps Refugee Private Sponsorship Program. This effort matches U.S. employers with skilled refugees for dignified, decent jobs in critical industries such as healthcare, education, and information technology. It represents, this new program represents a major innovation in how we connect resettled refugees to employment opportunities before they arrive here in the United States. We really believe that this is fundamental to enabling refugees' successful integration and ability to contribute to the new countries and communities. It also reflects our broader vision behind Welcome Corps. Our private sponsorship program was designed to strengthen and expand our country's capacity to resettle refugees by harnessing the energy of private sponsors from all walks of life across American society, but also to include businesses and companies. The last question that you asked me to speak on a little bit was examples of some successful multilateral engagements that state PRM has led to help address root causes. The most obvious example, and I probably, if I opened it up to the audience, you might all be able to say what it is, I think is the extraordinary humanitarian diplomacy that the US government has led in the Americas around the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection to promote safe, orderly, and humane migration. I don't want to dwell too much on this. You could have an entire day focused on this, but it is quite significant when you look back and start to tally up some of those accomplishments and outcomes. So Pillar 1 focuses on stability and assistance. Since fiscal year 2022, the U.S. has obligated more than $1.5 billion in support, which includes humanitarian, development, economic, health assistance in support of the regional response to the Venezuela crisis. On Pillar 2, and here this is really where there's been quite a lot of innovation, the creation of what we refer to as the Safe Mobility Offices, fondly known as the SMOs, and on refugee resettlement. So these offices and this new mechanism, it is in many ways one of the, I wouldn't say first, but it is an example of an effort, led largely by the United States to create alternative lawful pathways. And again, this is really at the center of so much of the solution work that the government has been doing and remains very focused on. So we went from nothing to, in the last year or so, with these new offices established, we are now on track to resettle between 35,000 to 50,000 refugees across the region, and they will have come through these new offices. Now, the other piece of the Safe Mobility Offices where we will all have to spend quite a lot of focused attention is on the labor pathways and matching of vulnerable migrants and refugees to those labor opportunities. Another piece of that, of course, also is the work that we've done to strengthen asylum systems. And this is important because obviously if refugees and others on the move can find protection in countries closer to the place from which they fled, that is a much, much better outcome than coming all the way up to the U.S. border. So I will sort of leave it there, but I do want to underscore the importance of this topic, the importance to which the U.S. government, how important we see it, and to say that, sometimes change is slow or slower than all of us would like, but it is the future and definitely a place where we would increasingly like to spend our limited resources, our diplomatic energy, and together with all of you, we're starting to see some real evolution and some real serious efforts to start to turn in that direction. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Assistant Secretary Campbell. Those remarks, and especially mentioning of the private sector involvement and the involvement of citizens in this effort to bring solutions or to find opportunities, which is why we have this diverse panel that I would call up to take their seat on the stage, and we'll start the conversation. Because of time, I will. You should have their bios with you, so I will just briefly abbreviate their bios, and then we'll go to the conversation. And Deputy Assistant Secretary will stay with us, and if you see her leave around 11:30, she's going to attend to other events, of course, as you know. It's very busy. So, starting from my left here is Dr. Sehahi Tefera, who is the founder, president, and CEO of the Ethiopian Community Development Council, a national refugee resettlement agency which he established in 1983, just 10 years after he arrived in the United States. Among his many recognitions and awards, Dr. Tefera was honored by the U.S. Coordinator of Refugee Affairs in 1991 for his outstanding contribution to the United States. And the city of Los Angeles honored him with an award for his contribution to improving the lives of refugees and immigrants. Dr. Rivera, glad to have you here on the panel to talk about some of the things that you are doing and have been doing. Next is Anton Lungu, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of the Republic of Moldova to the United States. He is a career diplomat with more than 15 years in foreign service. Prior to his current post, he was the head of Division for Economic and Sectorial Cooperation with EU, and has served in Moldova mission to the European Union and Ukraine. And he's going to bring the host country perspective. Moldova is hosting some of the Ukrainian refugees. Next is Lorena Goboya, who is the chair of the Board of Directors for Refugee Congress and Program Director for Awardly Global. A resettled refugee from Liberia, Goboya came to U.S. when she was only 4 years old after her family fled the war and initially found asylum in Ivory Coast. Her efforts working with refugees in Delaware led to the proclamation of June 20th as World Refugee Day in Delaware by the governor. She served on the board of Refugee Council USA, among others. Welcome. Next is Shazod Odilov, who is an associate partner at Korn Ferry, a renowned global management consulting firm where he works with Fortune 500 companies across various sectors. Displaced from his home country of Uzbekistan in Central Asia at the age of 15, he began a new life in the United States with hope and determination, despite facing immense uncertainty. Besides his consulting role, he also writes a weekly column for Forbes. He just had the article coming out, which he will talk about. Welcome. And last but not least is Gary Slayman, who is a corporate outreach advisor to Talent Beyond Boundaries and also an advisor to the business mechanism of the Global Forum for Migration and Development. He has long contributed to international policy development of better functional regular migration pathways. Example, he engaged in consultation and negotiation in the lead up to the Global Compact on Migration as a representative of the private sector. And he has long worked in the Senate, the private sector, law firms, and he's going to bring that package to this conversation. Thanks for joining us. So, for our online audience, thank you for staying engaged, and for our in-person audience, thank you again. We are going to have this moderated conversation here with the panelists, and then if we have time at the end, we will have just a small window for question. So let me start, and I have briefly touched base with all of you, but why don't you just start with what do you do, and of course, how it that relate to the importance of this day. So let me start with Gary.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate at the Wilson Center and on this important topic today. And as we think about Ms. Campbell's opening comments about the abilities and talents of refugees, that has been the focus of my attention. It really starts with the work I do for Talent Beyond Boundaries. I will describe it in more detail later, but the idea behind Talent Beyond Boundaries is to identify in the refugee communities those with skills that are needed globally and connect them to employers, and then use that skill and the job that comes with the connection to find a pathway, an additional pathway beyond asylum to move through labor mobility to a durable solution. And my work there with Talent Beyond Boundaries really has resulted in a much broader role that I play on behalf of the business community, both before the Global Forum for Migration and Development, but also with the UN network through the Executive Committee of the Business Advisory Group on which I serve.
Thank you. Very brief. And Shazad, I would ask you the same question. How does what you do relate to this and the importance of this day?
Yeah. So I work as a partner at Korn Ferry. It's a global human capital consulting firm, and I also write a column for Forbes on things like strategy, innovation, change, and so forth. But I'm also a former refugee. I came to the States when I was about 15 years old, alone, no family, no friends. I think I had like $50 in my pocket at the time. And the World Refugee Day, to me, it's obviously a day to recognize the resilience of millions of refugees worldwide. But for me, on a personal level, it's also a day to, reflect and think about my own experiences and challenges that I had to overcome. But perhaps more importantly, the opportunities that came about as a result of those experiences that I had to go through to ultimately set up a life in the U.S. And so, in my work as a partner at a global consulting firm, I bring in a lot of lessons that I've learned as a refugee around, how do you actually create resilience? How do you become, more change ready and so forth, and coach leaders and their employees to go through change in a similar fashion.
Thank you. Lorena, the same question.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. It's a great way to spend World Refugee Day, and it's also my mom's birthday, so I'm extra happy today. So professionally, I work at Upperly Global as the New York Program Director. We're a nonprofit workforce development organization which helps work authorized immigrant refugees and asylees who come into the U.S. with professional experience, but unfortunately they face many barriers and they don't know how to restart their careers. So we work with them to help them to make sure that they start working with jobs that align with their skills and really contribute to their communities. And I am also the board chair of Refugee Congress, and a lot of our work revolves around meaningful refugee participation and ensuring that we are able to help influence policy decisions. So we do a lot of work in that realm throughout our network, And this day is very important to me because, as some of you know, there's currently 117 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. And World Refugee Day both highlights those statistics, but it also celebrates the many contributions that refugees gift to their host communities. And notice I said gift, because oftentimes there are so many false narratives around refugees. And this day really celebrates those gifts that they really give to their communities.
Thank you. Anton, obviously what you do at the embassy, but what's your opening statement about this World Refugee Day?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. So as you mentioned, I'm a career diplomat. So from the work perspective, when the re-invasion of Ukraine started in February 2022, so it was a crisis, and we as diplomats, we were in the first line from the perspective of cooperating and maintaining dialogue with the development partners. So this support was great in helping the Republic of Moldova to offer the necessary support. So me, back then I was in the capital at the headquarters, so we had a big inflow of official high-level visits. So even the State Secretary Antony Blinken also visited at that time the Republic of Moldova. So with each visit, so we were also going to the centers where the refugees were placed. Me personally, I, for example, accompanied the High Representative of the European Union, Mr. Joseph Borrell. So that is one element I wanted to highlight from my personal perspective and how I see the World Refugee Day. So it's a moment of highlighting the human potential of those that are coming to and residing in our country. They contribute to our society, and is also a day to highlight and to point out the importance of solidarity. On a personal note, as you mentioned, so I was posted. I worked in Kiev. My first child was born in Kiev. my grandparents lived in a village of ethnic Ukrainians. They only spoke Ukrainian. So I'm telling all these elements to highlight that in Moldova we have very strong connections and links, and all the situation with the war starting and with the inflow of refugees also has a very big emotional component to this. Thank you.
Thank you. And those are the human face we want to put behind the statistic we hear. These are human stories which we are celebrating. So thanks for the time. Dr. Tefera, I will not ask you about what you do because you founded this institution that is doing something for the African refugees in particular, but all refugees worldwide. So I will jump into asking you the question. You can say the importance of the World Refugee Day, but my question to you, what motivated you to establish this institution? And that's the question you will answer, and then I will go back in circle. So welcome.
Thank you, John. Before I answer that question, I would like to make the following comments. Number one, it's irony, when the first World Refugee Day was celebrated after it was declared by the UN, the State Department and CDC hosted the first World Refugee Day awareness. And it was held at the Albert Einstein Memorial in front of the State Department. And the group that I took to the State Department were the Lost Boys from the from the Sudan. So for me, the World Refugee Day celebration is a recognition of the dire situations refugees are going through, unfortunately, in many, many countries. It is also a day to celebrate the achievements and the contributions that refugees have made to the host countries. And Einstein, it was fitting to celebrate and recognize World Refugee Day at the Einstein Memorial because Einstein himself was a refugee. And that shows the contributions refugees are making to their host countries. There are so many Einsteins that have fled, unfortunately, their respective countries. It's a loss to their home countries, but again to the host countries. So that I also want to take a moment to remember the thousands and millions of refugees who are now displaced, trying to find a safe home. And we also want to take a moment to remember the thousands of refugees who have lost their lives from trying to escape from their own countries and trying to find a way to safety. We have recently heard thousands of refugees, especially in the Horn of Africa, trying to flee to Libya, Egypt, and so on, who have lost their lives. And this is a day also to remember and the human loss. Coming back to your question, the CDC was established in 1983. At the time, there were upheavals going on in Ethiopia. So many refugees started coming to the United States. As a result of the Refugee Act of 1980, Africans became beneficiaries of resettlement to the United States. So we were not organized in order to be a voice for our respective communities. There were many, many agencies in the United States, mainstream ones, but we felt the refugee voice was not present at those discussions. And ECDC, basically, was born out of the desire to be a voice and to bring to the table the voice of the refugee community. That was how ECDC was established. So one of the things we focused was on policy issues. Refugee admissions are basically decided by the Department of State, by the US government, but it takes inputs from various sectors. Just to give you an example, in 1980, when the Refugee Act was proclaimed, there were only 800 refugees from the entire region of Africa, as opposed to over 100 some refugees from elsewhere. And that was not because there was no need for African refugees to be admitted, not because there were no needs, for refugees to seek safe haven in the United States, but the policy was basically based on those advocates, the voices, and so on. So one of the goals of ECDC was to really be a voice so that there would be an equity in our refugee program. That is one of the things that motivated us, was to be the voice. And as a result, during the past almost 40 years now, the African number has substantially increased every year. I feel that we had an impact. Second thing that motivated us was not only for ECDC to be at the table and be a voice, but to galvanize similar organizations around the country. As you know, as you see, there were 9 or 8 refugee resettlement agencies, and each one has basically their own affiliates. So if it is a U.S. Catholic of Conference, then they work with Catholic organizations. If it's a Lutheran, the same thing. HIAS also works with, Jewish family services around the country and so on. So there was no room really for community-based organizations established locally by refugees, for refugees, to be in the resettlement field. So ECDC, when it became a national volunteer agency in 1991, it by design said we need to bring not only ECDC at this table, but the refugee community in the various regions and cities. Therefore, what we did was we looked for African and other refugee community organizations that were locally established by refugees, for refugees, to be at the table. That was our second goal. I must say today we have about 26 resettlement agencies that are primarily run and manned by former refugees and immigrants. So this was the
and thank you for that institutional background, and also one of the reasons why we are celebrating what we are celebrating today, because the impact of such, and you will highlight later on. Anton, I'm coming back to you. From the perspective of a host country, Moldova has shown exemplary leadership, standing in solidarity with Ukrainian refugees, providing protection. How are the refugees being integrated in Moldova? You talk about these countries have cultural ties there, so oftentimes when refugees go to an asylum country, there are challenges. But what can you highlight about the integration?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think the integration is going well. Of course, there are some issues, there are some problems, but I just want a bit also to give like a perspective how things work and why the impact towards Moldova was so big. So if to take a size, Republic of Moldova is practically as the size of the state of Maryland, and it's 3 times more smaller than the state of Virginia. Its population, it's 2.5 million. And the flow of Ukrainian citizens that entered the Republic of Moldova since the start of the war was more than 1 million. Those that resided at the peak were like around 150,000, and now in Moldova there are around 60,000 refugees, out of which 49,000 are women and around 14 are minors. So if you take in comparison with the number of population, and also the fact that a part of the population also are working abroad, so that comparatively is a big number. So it's around like 4 or 5% of the population by some estimates. So the Moldovans have opened their hearts and their homes to our neighbors and friends from Ukraine. And they benefit of a lot of services also with the support of the development partners. So the kids are going to school, and education is free of charge for the minors. They benefit of urgent care, they benefit of primary care, they benefit of social assistance programs. They have the possibility to also integrate into the workforce. Our specific is that in our country people are bilingual. They speak Romanian and they also speak Russian. And in Ukraine, people also speak Ukrainian and a part of also know the Russian language. So it's easy to integrate from the perspective if you speak the Russian language. So from my perspective, so the integration is going well. Of course, there are problems, but with perspective and with planning in the long term, you are able to overpass these setbacks and problems.
Yeah, thank you. Lorena, how does your lived experience inform your current work? You came here when you were only 4, but your family story lives in you. So how does that inform your perspective and your current work?
Absolutely. I love that. My family story, in fact, does live in me. So as you said, I was 4 years old when I was fortunate to be resettled with my family here in the U.S. And when I think of where I am now, personally and professionally, I think back what would have been of me had I not been, afforded this opportunity. So I've worked in resettlement, and I always see, when the kids of these families who are 4, and I look at them and I see my younger self in them. And I also think about, the other 4-year-olds who are currently a part of that 117, million who are currently forcibly displaced, and what their future looks like, and all of those thoughts really inform my work. It's at the top of mind in everything that I do. This is why I'm so, dedicated to this cause. Oftentimes people who are within my community, they said, they always try to say that I'm not a true Liberian because I was so young when I came to the U.S., but it's really not about that. It's about what my family went through. And when I share my story, I always share it through the eyes of my mother, because I was about 2 years old when the war started in Liberia, and through her bravery and courage, we were able to flee to the Ivory Coast. So just, and I actually didn't really learn my story until I was in grad school, because my mother was always traumatized. They never wanted to really share and talk about it. Till this day, when we're watching the news and my mother sees soldiers and things and she doesn't even want to look at it, right? She still has that trauma. So it's, this was an open door for me to continue to carry that legacy and really ensure that we were afforded this opportunity, but there are others out there who weren't. How do we continue to help to raise these issues and lift their voices? And so, that's why, I continue to do this work, and this is what impacts what I do.
Thank you. And that's the same question, Shehzad. You came here when you were a teenager from Uzbekistan. How did you successfully integrate into this society, and what you are doing now, how does that translate to what you're doing?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I think integration, initially for me at least, wasn't really the goal. It was about survival, right? When you show up in a brand new country, you're 15 years old, you don't have any kind of resources, you don't know anyone, and so for me, it was initially about how do I survive? How do I actually make things happen so I have a life here? But then later on, it does actually become integration. I think there are 4 key things if I think about that. And I think number 1 was the fact that I was so young. I wasn't 4, I was 15. But I think I was young enough to be open to new opportunities, and I wanted to make friends, and I wanted to get to know people and so forth. And so I think just kind of having that kind of open mindset made a lot of opportunities possible for me eventually. The second piece, I think, is the language piece. I'd like to think I spoke decent English when I came to the U.S., and then I went to, live in Arkansas for a few years, and, heard the Southern accent for the first time, and kind of made me question the confidence that I had. But, but the language piece is, was important for me. If you think about 72% of refugees or asylees that come to the U.S. don't actually speak English. And so for me, that was an advantage because I got to go to school and make friends and get a job and so forth right away. The third piece is perhaps the most important piece for me was I chose to be a part of a pre-existing community in the U.S. So for example, I sought out a church community that I could be a part of, and that particular community, basically became my, family and supported me, gave me mentorship and guidance and so forth. And I think that's an important part of the equation, because I think a lot of times we do talk about host countries and communities needing to be open to receiving refugees and asylees and so forth. But then the second piece of the equation, success equation there, is I think we need to also talk about and encourage refugees to actually want to integrate into communities and become part of, active members of communities that they're going into. And the last thing I'm going to mention is I think there was a mindset shift that happened after about 3 or 4 years for me, where I shifted from thinking about the past and thinking about obstacles to, thinking more and more about the future. So I kind of put myself in a situation where, every day you wake up and you have to, move away from the temptation and not think about the trauma that you've experienced in the past, but then, intentionally say, I'm going to actually focus on today. I'm going to focus on tomorrow, and then you start seeing opportunities that you didn't realize you had at that point.
Thank you. And you mentioned a key point here, that integration is a two-way process. The receiving community has to make that environment conducive, but also the refugee has to be willing to integrate, and I think that's a good point. And thanks for those key. Gary, coming to you, so we start with the host country. We have 2 former refugees that have been hosted, and creating opportunities for people, just as Shehzad mentioned, is also something that is also a challenge. So how does Talent Beyond Boundaries do this for the displaced people, the refugees? If you could speak to that.
Sure. So the idea of Talent Beyond Boundaries really began with the proposition that among the many millions of refugees and displaced, there are many, many people with skills and abilities. I mean, we often think on World Refugee Day about strength, courage, resilience, but there's also skills and talents. And, at the beginning, there was skepticism about the founders' efforts here, that the skilled people had somehow found their way to opportunity and that they didn't exist in the refugee world. And that's clearly not true. And so this was an innovative approach. I need to, again, thank PRM for their early vision and support for this idea to be explored. And it, in some ways, it was controversial. People think of refugees as one category and migrants as another category. I can't tell you how strong the view was during the negotiation of the Global Compact on Migration, that if you want to speak about refugees, go to Geneva, talk within the contours of the Global Compact on Refugees, but migrants, that's an inappropriate conversation here. And I think we've broken that, that prejudice or that commitment to these old structures through proving, as TBB has done, that if you identify these skills, and this is what we did, they began with a talent catalog, and they went into the refugee communities and explained that we were going to explore an opportunity, that their skills could be their pathway to a durable solution. And through detailed meetings, small group meetings, convinced people to bring forward their detailed resumes, their work histories, their education, and build them into a robust catalog that could be then shared with businesses. And business could look at these people for their abilities, not for their status, and give them opportunity. And then working with government to make these pathways work, because normal visa pathways, and that's why it's a complementary pathway, it's not an asylum pathway, it's a work visa pathway, that there are barriers that are particular to, that makes it difficult for even when the person has the ability and the job opportunity has been offered, there are barriers that need to be addressed to permit that movement. And so what Talent Beyond Boundaries does is really tripartite. It works with the candidates, it works with the private sector, and it works with the governments to allow this movement. And that's what we do. And I think I'll talk a little more about the successes, but the idea had vibrancy, and I think we've proven the model works because the skills are there.
And I want to, again, start from there to this again. So I'm going to put you on the next question, which is the meat of the discussion. This is the round two question for all of you. That talk about the example, the success story that could impact the narrative, because we are celebrating talents today, and I think the narrative about how refugees are framed need evidence to for people to understand that. So, what are your success stories?
So your question's an essential one, and I will get to it at the end, but it begins with outcomes. It begins with the success stories you talk about. To prove that the skills are there by providing the opportunity, by providing the employment. TBB began as a pilot. We had small, and frankly, we were advised by the State Department, don't be so ambitious. There are challenges here you're going to have to address. But what became a small pilot has ballooned into quite a deal of successes. We've found durable solutions for about 2,000 refugees, and we've moved them to jobs. Initially, we didn't look to the U.S. As a destination country. Our visa systems were not going to be conducive without statutory change. We may get to that issue. But we looked to Canada and Australia and ultimately the UK. And we have more and more destination countries that have come to us since. We've now been asked by Belgium and Portugal and Ireland. Other EU countries have come and said, we want to be destination countries. Importantly, the pilot began really with the Syrian refugee crisis. So we were in Lebanon and Jordan, identifying talents and moving that population. But today, and this is a huge success, we have expanded our host country targets to Latin America and Central America, to Asia, to Africa. We have a significant program in Africa. Partly at the behest of the governments that we work with, the destination governments that said, expand your range. Let's find more communities where they're displaced, where we can find paths for them. And let me just say finally, in terms of the narrative, if you begin with outcomes and you begin with success stories, that is the essence for changing the narrative. We are so dependent on governments to work with us to make the pathways work that, as we all know, governments are challenged by migration policies. These are difficult issues, certainly in the US, but worldwide. And my proposition has always been, if you want to change the narrative around refugees and displaced, it can begin in the workplace. When you show somebody that has moved to a country of destination and contributes, doesn't draw, but contributes to the GDP, helps economic development, integrates in the workplace, that to me is one of the most powerful messages that can change what is a very otherwise negative narrative.
Oh, thank you. And as a former refugee myself, and that's important, changing the narrative, talking about positive contribution, recognizing that, yes, not all refugees are the same. But again, we want to move to that narrative part, which is always not seen. And Shazot, the same question, example of refugee contribution to the labor market in terms of what you are doing and what your current work organization is doing from the private sector, but also your own experience in your professional career. What do you have?
Yeah, so it's interesting you're asking that, because I a couple of days ago wrote a column for Forbes, and I can talk about government policy, but essentially the narrative for the column was, there's a lot of change happening in the private sector, right? So if you think about generative AI, economic instability, inflation, and so forth, and refugees can actually bring a lot to the table, and there's a lot to show for that from a data perspective, right? So recently, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, they published a longitudinal study. They looked at the past 15 years and found that refugees made a net positive fiscal impact of over $123 billion on the U.S. economy and government budget. So that's one. Refugees also tend to be more entrepreneurial in general. 14% of refugees end up at some point owning businesses, compared to about 11% of other immigrants and about 9% of the U.S. born population. So, think about the impact of that in terms of not just a national level, but also local economies in terms of, tax revenue generation, job creation, and so forth. And if you think about this from a dynamic of the U.S. labor market today, right? So Gary, mentioned this a little bit. There's this huge skills gap. In fact, in my work, we did a study at Korn Ferry. We found that about 74% of leaders today say that they're struggling with filling some critical skills in their organizations, and that they're not ready to actually become this future-ready, change-ready organization. And then you think about refugees and asylees coming into the United States. About 50% of them come in with at least a bachelor's degree. And a lot of them are experienced in healthcare, IT, engineering, and so forth. And so there's this huge untapped potential, from a standpoint of the private sector and corporate leaders to tap into that talent. But obviously there's some challenges, and that's one of the things that I do at Korn Ferry. We work with corporate leaders to really reimagine their talent acquisition strategies, retention strategies, and then also think about ultimately how do you actually not just hire talent for the sake of talent, but intentionally think about the talent that you can't tap into, because they're not on LinkedIn, they're not on Glassdoor, and so forth. So I think that from a narrative standpoint, sure, there needs to be a change in the narrative. I think we need to, in the private sector, also start thinking about refugees and asylees not just as beneficiaries of social corporate responsibility, but also active contributors in our workplaces and communities as well.
Yeah. And Lorena, people should not just look at economic contribution to measure the impact of refugees. There are more than that. And, with the cultural, with the professional, and you chair the board of directors for Refugee Congress, which on the advocacy side, there's an impact. And also your own organization you work for, Upwardly Global. What are some of the examples about the impact of your work?
Sure. There's so much that can be said here. I want to preface by saying that, refugees come into the U.S. or to their other host countries with just so much skills and experience that is often sometimes it goes unnoticed or, people don't really consider it. But that's one great thing about our network, Refugee Congress. We are a large member network of refugees or forcibly displaced people. The organization was built and led by refugees and forcibly displaced. So we spent a lot of time just really ensuring that we continue to increase the leadership potential that we already have as refugee leaders coming into our own respect. We've been around now for a little over 10 years, but the last 5 years, we've really thought about how, we fit into the work that we do in this space, right? We now have a greater understanding of the fact that equitable policies and welcoming communities only take form when they're built and led by leaders with lived experience. And this is the work that we're doing. This is the work that we're pushing forth, and this is the message that we continue to carry. Two things that I really want to highlight. Number one is that this will be our 4th year in a row in which we'll be coordinating an effort on a letter to the administration requesting a robust presidential determination on refugee resettlement here in the U.S. And this letter is one that is quite referenced a lot. It's appreciated and is usually taken into consideration. And so we continue to really build strong relationships with the administration, with different NGO partners, which really help to move policy work and ideas along. And another instance that I wanted to highlight is the formation of the U.S. Refugee Advisory Board. I definitely want to give a special thanks to Assistant Secretary Noyes and Deputy Assistant Secretary Campbell and the PRM team for their deep engagement with and partnership with the U.S. Refugee Advisory Board, which was formed by Refugee Congress, RC USA, that's Refugee Council USA, and also Georgetown Institute for the Study of International Migration. So the USRAB, which is the U.S. Refugee Advisory Board, is basically a mechanism that really provides a transparent and accountable way for meaningful participation of refugees in multilateral settings, and it ensures that the interests, perspectives, and knowledge and experiences of forcibly displaced people are consistently engaged around global solutions. So we're really proud of this work, and we really look forward to continuing these efforts.
Thank you. And again, thank you for engaging with us online and here as you listen to the conversation we have. Anton, what policy lesson can other host countries learn from Moldova? Moldova is a very small country in Europe, and per capita is hosting refugees, and other countries are not. So what can you say about policy of the host country?
Yeah, thank you. Again, I'll mention a bit in perspective. Important is the will, and important is to stay true to your values. Hypothetically, due to the consequences after COVID, due to the fact that we were blackmailed from the energy point of view, due to the other constraints that we had, very easily the authorities in Moldova would have said, look, we close the borders, there is the breakaway region of Transnistria, we have security issues, we close the borders, and that would not affect as such the movement of citizens from Ukraine, because if you close the border of Moldova, from Odessa region you went a bit further and you would have the possibility to enter to Romania, and at the north you had the possibility just to redirect and go to Poland, where the big flows of refugees as number also went. And it was it would have been fine because everyone would have would have understood the arguments brought by the authorities. The calculations were that our capacity of accepting the transit of refugees and hosting them was around like probably 10 times less than it actually was. But somehow we managed. It was a mobilization of the civil society. It was a mobilization of business. It was a mobilization of citizens. And we were earned, again, I was saying about values. So we like to call ourselves as a nation that has a high degree of hospitality. So after the experience, again, I said at the beginning, like the notion, a small country with big heart. So that was a proof that the Moldovans have opened their hearts, have opened their houses to the friends and neighbors from Ukraine. So that's one element. From policy perspective, coordination again, looking at this at the subject from at the high level, and again bringing the entire society on board. And promoting the correct messaging, what is happening, why it's important, and bringing aboard the people, the business, the civil society. That's important. And again, as I also mentioned at the beginning, looking in perspective, not only planning and doing your actions as for the situation as it is now as crisis, but also looking at it in a further perspective and more from the development point of view, and integrating the refugees and offering them opportunities and possibilities. And here I will come to some concrete examples. We are a small country. People are trying to go abroad to make a better living, make bigger salaries. So you have the problems in villages, especially because people migrate from villages to the capital, that you have a lack of teachers, you have lack of doctors, you have lack of a lot of specialists. And there are specific cases when very, very, very wonderful ones, when citizens of Ukraine, refugees, have had the possibility to get jobs. They integrated in the community. People are speaking about them that, look, we like them, it's our doctor, it helps us, it helps the elderly, it helps families with numerous children. So these are examples that are super examples of teachers, examples of those that are coming to train children to do karate. Then you train children that live in Moldova. Then you also integrate with programs that to attract also children that are refugees. And you build inclusion, you build consensus, and I think that's the success story in all the situation that happened with the war in Ukraine. Thanks.
Thank you, and for highlighting that. And it's key things that it's a small country with big heart. That's really a key. And Dr. Tefera, now we started with you, ECDC, how it started, and you said it was 800 Africans when it was established that you resettled. Now where are you? What can you say about the impact in improving the lives, providing durable solution? And then we go back to we are almost there to the point where we'll provide closing remarks, but before that we'll turn to the audience. So quickly, what are some of the impacts ECDC has done?
Okay. Again, thank you. The 800 that I referred to were 800 refugees that were admitted to the United States as a whole, resettled by different agencies, and not by ECDC. But the impact that I want to stress today is because of the formations, collaborations, partnerships that have been created, we have seen an increased number of refugees coming to the United States. That's one. And again, by establishing the various community-based organizations, these are organizations that are creating employment opportunities for refugees also. If you take the total family of ECDC and this network, we employ close to 1,000 some former refugees and immigrants in professional jobs. And so that is really success. Now, when you take the country as a whole in terms of what it is benefiting, I think my friend earlier mentioned the study that was done by the Office of Refugee Settlement. The amount of funds, expenses we give to refugees is far less than what refugees contribute to the country. The image that we have on the street is refugees are here draining our resources and so on. It's quite the contrary. This narrative has to be really told clearly. Refugees do work hard, contribute in taxes and what have you. So that's the narrative that has to be told again and again. The other thing that I see as a positive contribution of refugees, I think the United States is what it is today because of the infusion of cultures from other parts of the world. And refugees, by coming here, have significantly contributed to the diversity. I know there are people who want, who see diversity as a threat, but I am a firm believer that diversity is strength if it is handled rightly. So wherever you go, to small cities, I will give you, we started a center in Brattleboro, Vermont, a small town. We brought in Afghan refugees during the Afghan crisis. The community welcomed them very warmly. Now, if you know rural Vermont, basically it was not diverse. Now, because of the refugees from Africa, from Afghanistan and so on, we have added to the diversity in the community. I would say the same in Wisconsin. We are in a rural area, a small town. We have added, the diversity of the community, and the community is benefiting of it. Wherever you go, in the past, Chinese food was among the most popular one. Now we have added to the menu Afghan bread, Ethiopian food, and so on. So we are basically creating to the diversity. In terms of talents, I want to mention many of the refugees that come are, as it was said earlier, highly educated, with skills in their own rights, with academic backgrounds and what have you. When the Office of Refugee was established in 1980 as a result of Congressional Act, since 1980, two of the directors in the past how many years have been former refugees. One was a Vietnamese former refugee who has a PhD. He was appointed by President Bush to be the director of the Office of Refugee Settlement. This is the highest office that basically oversees the refugee resettlement in this country. The second person that was appointed by President Obama as the director of the Office of Refugee Settlement was also, a former refugee, Iskandar Nagash. And these are just few examples that I want to mention. Wherever you go, in the Department of State, the Department of Health, Human Services, in the Homeland Security, you have former refugees that are contributing. At the local level, we see a number of former refugees who have basically entered into politics. We have few congressional representatives from Minnesota and so on. We have also local school boards, city councils. So the contribution that refugees are making to the country needs to be recognized. And finally, I want to say, in the past, we used to go to the State Department encouraging them to increase the refugees and so on. I must say, this with the administration that we have this year, it has been, the administration is willing to work, as you heard it, with all of us to ensure that refugees are properly admitted and helped. So I want to say thank you to the administration for working with us. The initiatives that you have, with the Welcome Corps, the private sector, these are new initiatives. And instead of depending on one venue, so the regular admission, we have those various venues for refugees to be admitted. And the community is basically taking the responsibility through the Welcome Corps. I would say, I don't have the exact figures, but I would say 70 to 80% of those who have forward come to be responsible for resettling refugees are former refugees and immigrants. So the community is basically giving back. It's not always, sitting there and taking. So I must say, the contribution of refugees is significant, and we're also appreciative of the larger community for welcoming and be willing to integrate refugees.
Thank you. And speaking of giving back, these are the stories you highlight, all of you, and this is what we are celebrating today. The talents, how they enrich our cultures through food, music, athletes, in sports, as we heard. That is the human face we want to paint in the narrative. Now, before I come back to the panel to have their 30-second closing remarks, I would like to turn to you, the audience, and if there are questions that need to be asked, because I'm going to pick just only two. We have only 5 minutes before we close. So raise up your hand and ask the question only. After you introduce yourself, just ask the question. Then we will all be grateful if you make it brief. Just one question. Okay. Team 1, and this gentleman here, and you. Okay. I increased to 3, but please stay. But please stay. 30 seconds.
Very quickly, but I have to thank you, Jonathan, for pulling this group together. As Lorena, I think, mentioned, this is a really nice way to spend World Refugee Day, hearing this panel, putting this panel together. So excellent job to everybody. I'm Tim Docking. I work with the Refugee Investment Network, and we are a new impact investing intermediary that's creating impact investing thematic called Refugee Lens Investing. So that's who I am. But I would like to just pick up on a theme that many of you touched on, and that's narrative change. And I'd like to direct, I could ask all of you a question, but I'll just direct this question to Shirzad. Given the fact that the forced displaced crisis globally has been demagogued politically and has been and is so severely right now, speak, what you think ideally the private sector's role could be in changing the narrative. You mentioned some really interesting statistics that I think can sway people's thinking about displaced people. But ideally, where does this need to go, and how hopeful are you that that can make an impact on the narrative change?
Yeah,
Thank you. We'll come back. I'm going to take a round, and then I will turn it to you. So hold on to that. Okay. Thank you, Tim.
So I heard a lot about skills, and that's a good thing. But what about finding housing? Now you do realize that we are back in our housing inventory, the U.S. And NIMBYs are a big concern for refugees. A lot of people don't want certain refugees of certain style. Not to but could you speak about housing? Where will you find housing? And also, in terms of skills, are we looking at also bringing a lot of farmers as well? Because I've noticed that we have a lack of farmers, and you cannot live without a farmer for a few days. That's the truth. So yeah, could you elaborate?
Thank you. That was brief, and you did not state your name. We got no time. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you for the balance of your time. That was Joshua. It was here. Okay. Oh, did somebody raise his hand? Yeah, she's here.
Thank you very much. My question is going to be very brief. My name is Megdes. I am the Senior Program Officer for the PC program at ECDC. My question is for one of the panelists, is Mr. Gary. For the skills-based pathways that you do as at the Talent Beyond, do you by any chance coordinate your work with the 9 RAs that work with refugees? One is ECDC and the other agencies on that, because since funding for all the great work that the RAs do is not enough, some agencies also run enterprise development groups that are targeting newcomer, like empowering economic work on economic empowerment of the newcomers who are already resettled here, but they may have like insights in that regard. And if not, what are you planning for the future? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, those were the hands that were raised. Who would like to answer the question about housing or farmers' skills? But Shazot, go ahead. Talk about what could the private sector role be in changing the narrative, and that would be 30 seconds. Gary, same question. Does TBB coordinate with the 10 resettlement agencies that are resettling refugees here and find way to, and then the housing question? I think it's affordability, those kind of things. Maybe we'll float around, one of you answer. And then I will have you do your final closing. So, hurry up. Let's start with Gary.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Talent Beyond Boundaries is totally dependent on partnerships throughout this process. As I said earlier, we initially focused on destination countries of Canada, Australia, and the UK. We now have a US program, and it's in its infancy. We'll be working with Welcome Corps at Work, and maybe this is partly answer to the housing question. The theory there is that there are other sponsorship programs in the world. Canada has one that's quite successful. But typically they go to the community first and they say, will you sponsor somebody? And that community takes on demands like housing and other constraints that a newcomer would have. The idea behind this program in the US is that it starts with the job. So that the person that comes over will have the opportunity already to be earning income. and it puts less burden on the community, which then has to contribute. Now, the employers, we've had examples where employers have contributed to housing because they need the workforce. This is about skills gaps that can't otherwise be filled by the local population. But there's a limit to how much an employer can do in this environment in terms of the costs associated with finding talent. So community organizations are critical to us. The more we move into a country of destination, the more we engage them and work with them. I mean, we have to engage with the candidates, with the employer, with the visa systems and the lawyers necessary. But for integration, for working with communities, we are totally dependent and want to work with communities on the ground that are familiar with the territory and can fill the gaps we can't.
Thank you. You just use one stone to handle two birds. And so the housing question is answered and touch base. Shehzad?
Yeah, so I think the private sector, the corporations, can actually be become catalysts to help change the narrative ultimately. Because if you think about what they're looking for highly skilled workforce to ultimately help them become this, resilient and change-ready organizations for the future. If you think about what refugees and asylees are looking for, they're looking, to build a better life, new life, in the U.S. and they are highly skilled. But, I think corporations can do two specific things to actually help refugees and asylees, integrate and become part of the workforce. Number one, refugees run into issues around credentialing, right? So about 50% of refugees coming into the U.S., they have at least a bachelor's degree, as I mentioned. But those degrees don't necessarily translate over into the U.S., right? So the credentials are not very well recognized. And so I think companies can actually do a better job of maybe moving away from a degree-based type of hiring and retaining talent to more of a skills-based, hiring and retaining talent. And that's already happening already. You see a lot of, even in tech companies that are kind of moving away from, requiring degrees and so forth and focusing more on skills. The second piece is a language barrier. As I mentioned, about 72% of refugees and asylees coming into the U.S., they don't actually speak English as their primary language. But they have the experiences and the skills and so forth needed to actually do the job. And so, the shift there is how do you actually upskill, perhaps not your employees, but potential talent pool that you're tapping into. Maybe, create some feeder programs where you do actually tap into a refugee and asylee, candidates potentially, and then upskill them, give them opportunities to learn English for a few months or a few years, and then they come and work for you for a certain amount of years and so forth. So I think those two things specifically, I think organizations can start doing to ultimately help refugees and asylees.
Thank you very much. Now we are going to give your closing remarks, and we only have literally 1 minute left. So let me start with Anton. What is your one advice to the audience about the utilizing refugee talent? It could be what you already said, and you can repeat it. Just one single advice. And then Lorena will go, and then I will have Dr. Tefera, and then Shehzad, and then Gary will have the last word. So, one advice.
Each challenge should also be viewed from the angle of opportunity. Each human being has big potential. The refugees are passing through trauma, through hardships. So if we want to help them flourish their talents, so we have to do our best to make them feel and overpass these negative feelings. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
One of my favorite sayings is that refugees are not asking for a hand out, they're only asking for a hand up. So I hope that you will take that with you and recognize that, a lot of refugees coming into the country, they come with expertise along with their stories that live inside of them. So really recognizing that expertise that they bring could help them, and that's you, of course, helping them with that hand up And just a lot of what Shirzad has been saying is a lot of the work that we do at Upperly Global in terms of, recognizing those skills. And I also wanted to highlight that there are currently 2.3 million internationally educated immigrant and refugees here in the U.S. And because of the barriers such as language, credential evaluation, those things really keep them away from working in jobs that are actually will give them survival wages, but they're oftentimes stuck in what we call survival jobs. So that's the work that we're doing. And I just wanted to add that the impact at Upperly Global, who has been around now for about 2 decades, we've helped over 10,000 immigrant and refugee job seekers land professional level roles with an average starting salary of about $60,000.
Thank you. Dr. Tefera, last word.
Well, thank you for convening this session. It's very important. As we are celebrating diversity during World Refugee Day, I want us, to commit to see that there is an environment conducive for refugees around the world. Each person that is out there needs you to voice your concerns, your support. Policies are made by people, and as community members, as citizens, we have an obligation to ensure that there is equity and support. So let us be a moral pressure to care for our fellow human beings. By doing that, we are doing it for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shahzad?
Yeah, Gary mentioned earlier, if we're going to change the narrative, we need to start with the outcome. And I think the new outcome that a lot of organizations, leaders, corporate leaders, public sector leaders are looking for at this point is, how do you become more comfortable with change and disruption going forward? You have economic instability, you have generative AI impacting a lot of industries, you have geopolitical issues. And part of it is that you actually hire people and bring people into the organization that are comfortable with change and disruption. And those are refugees and asylees. And they've lived it, and I've lived it, and I know that they can actually come into your organizations and help you become the kind of organizations you're looking to be, so you don't have to start from scratch.
Thank you. Gary, take it away.
So my one comment was, having started with outcomes at TBB, we're very focused on systemic change. And that is why I spend so much time flying around the world and going to global forums to discuss migration policy and use TBB as the example for why systemic change can be so beneficial. It's a challenge. People don't like change. We have structures that we have to break down. But the proof is that this is a solution that can really move the whole conversation, as the conversation today has. I mean, we were talking about the talents of the refugees. So often on World Refugee Day, we talk about strength and courage, but talk about their talent. That is the beginning of systemic change. Thank you.
Well, I would like us to give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you very much. And I would like to also thank my RAFD team here, Joshua and the interns and everyone else involved in this at the Wilson Center. I also want to thank you, the audience, online and in person, for observing the World Refugee Day with us and for celebrating refugee talents and host country leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you.